Shana Tova. In 1898, more than 100 years ago, Mark Twain wrote, "All things are mortal except the Jew. All other forces pass, but the Jew remains." And then he asked, what is the secret of their immortality? Perhaps the most perplexing element of the whole history of Jews is that there are still Jews at all. How have we survived? How have we survived such a history of trauma and persecution? One of the things that I discovered about myself on October 7th and in the weeks and months that followed is that I was experiencing generational trauma, something I had never encountered before in my life. As far as I know, I have no close relatives that died in the Shoah. My family came to the United States in the mid-1800s. It's not clear if they were running from something in Odessa and Kyiv, where we trace our family roots to, or if they were running to something in America, namely the gold rush in San Francisco. What is clear is that Jewish trauma was not a story that I grew up with around our Seder table. But even still, on October 7, 2023, I had the horrible feeling deep in my soul that it was happening again. The it was the attempt to annihilate my people. And the again was every story of pogrom and persecution, blood libel and expulsion, forced conversion and genocide that had haunted my people's history. Psychologists speak of a flight or fight response, the well-documented binary of either fighting back in the face of adversity or running away from it. Both are predicated on the instinctive human response to survive. In my own experience, there is a third response that has been employed by the Jewish people for thousands of years and is one of the answers, I think, to the question, why are there still Jews at all? And that response is adapt. Time and again, too many times, again and again, the Jewish people have faced moments like October 7th. This is not new. Ein chadash tachat hashamayim. Nothing new under the sun. And in each instance, our response has been to adapt in order to survive. Now, sometimes that meant run, as generations of Jews did from the Crusaders, the Cossacks, the Inquisitors, the Nazis. And sometimes that meant fight, like Moses did with that Egyptian taskmaster who was beating a Hebrew slave, like the Maccabees did during the story of Hanukkah, like the fighters of the Warsaw Ghetto, the Haganah in Israel's War of Independence, and the IDF, as they have been called to do again and again, even on our holiest of days. But in countless smaller moments that preceded or followed those calamities, the Jewish response has been to adapt, to exhibit resilience through flexibility and through creativity, setting the preservation of our people, the preservation of our faith, of our tradition, above any reflexive response to fight or flee. In the Talmud, the rabbis debate. Well, they debate a lot in the Talmud, but in this particular instance, they debate this question. And they debate which is a better example for the Jewish people. To stand strong like a cedar tree that grows by the side of the river, standing tall and firm as it gets battered by the winds, the river rushing past its roots, eroding the soil beneath it until a wind blowing from just the right or wrong direction uproots it and topples it over. Or is it better for the Jewish people to be like a reed that bends and flexes with the current, adapting and adjusting to the pressures coming from all different directions, surviving against forces aligned against it, even generating offspring in the midst of the tumult and the chaos of the current? Rabbi Eliezer ben Shimon says, a person should always be flexible like a reed and not rigid like a cedar. Our tradition emphasizes the value of humility, of flexibility, and the ability to bend with challenges, rather than being rigid and potentially uprooted like a cedar, which, though strong, may be inflexible and prone to breaking under pressure. It highlights the virtue of adaptability and resilience in navigating life's difficulties. Resilience is generally defined as the ability of an individual to bend but not break, to bounce back and to adapt well in the face of adversity, trauma, tragedy, threats, or even significant stress. Look at the story and the history of the Jewish people. We are resilient. We have this uncanny superpower to adapt and reinvent ourselves, to meet crisis with creativity. Think about it for a minute. All of the great books, and we are the people of the book, all of the great books of our tradition were written in response to catastrophe. Freed from an immoral slavery in Egypt, we received and wrote Torah, a moral ethical code, we're going to read from it tomorrow, that would attest to our covenant with God, the source of our redemption, and demand that we identify the pharaohs of future generations. Through the lens of that book, we are to see the present day. When the temples were destroyed and with it our means and our medium for worship, we adapted. We replaced sacrifice with prayer. That's why you're here. Conceiving of a whole new relationship with God through study and inquiry, we recorded the evolution of that new way of observing the covenant in the Mishnah and the Talmud. We wrote down the rules on how to do this. And we called it halakha, literally the way to do it, or the way forward, as in a new way to live in an uncertain and unprecedented time for the Jewish people. When the Enlightenment thinkers emphasized reason and empirical evidence over faith and tradition, many people questioned religious doctrines and the validity of divine revelation, not just Jews, people all over the world. Judaism's response was to develop Kabbalah and the Zohar, a mystical lens through which we could see and still experience the awe and wonder of the natural world, while still embracing science and reason at the same time. In the 19th century, the rise of nationalist movements in Europe threatened Jewish survival. And rather than capitulate and assimilate and lose our identity, Jewish leaders asserted their own national identity. And they called it Zionism, and framed the Jewish people as a distinct nation deserving of our own homeland. And after the Shoah, the greatest crisis perhaps of faith, we asked, where was God? Now, some abandoned their faith, but many others created Jewish communities and institutions that became the God that we wanted to worship, but missed in the Shoah. The Canadian Jewish community, this community, is a product of that adaptation and that resilience. We redeemed Jews because God redeems. We liberate because God liberates. We work for civil rights and social justice because God instructs us, tzedek, tzedek tirdof, justice, justice you shall pursue. We became the God we missed in the Holocaust. In every moment when we are lost, when we face uncertainty, when we are in the wilderness, our response is not fight or flight. Our response is improvise, adapt, and overcome. Torah was given, received, and cultivated in the wilderness. Jews became a people in the wilderness. The wilderness, it is harsh and unforgiving, but time and again throughout history, it's been the most formative, the most transformative experience of our people ever. The law of the wilderness is adapt or perish. And we learned that, and we have taught that. Lador vador, from generation to generation, adapt or perish. It's inspired all of our efforts. In spite of all of the efforts to destroy us, we are still here. Now, maybe that's the burden and also the blessing of being a Jew. We're always in the wilderness. striving towards a promised land, a promised time, but never quite getting there, confronting the brutal reality of the world as it really is. But in the striving, in the wilderness, in that journey, our true character is formed and the dangers to our survival are revealed so that we can confront them. And as our people have done time and again for today, 5,785 years, depending on how you count, we have adapted, we have survived, and often we've even thrived in the face of it. Now, psychologists tell us that we can think of resilience as a set of skills that can be and often are learned skills. Part of the skill building comes from exposure to very difficult but manageable experiences. Stress isn't all bad. If you can cope today with all that's happening in the world around you, then when you are on the other side of it, you will be stronger. We've learned that in our lives. That's been true for the Jewish people, and it is true for so many of us in this room as families and as individuals. It is true for you. Think of what you have overcome and what you're on the other side of now, and how that has strengthened you and made you into who you are. How we cope depends on what is in our resilience toolbox. For some people, the only tools that they have are a hammer to hit back or a saw to cut and run. I like to think that over the millennia, Jews have assembled a bit more of an eclectic toolbox than just a saw and a hammer. We've actually filled our toolbox with implements of resilience, the right tool for the right job, as I tell my kids when we build things. The tools common to resilient people, the tools common to the Jewish people, are optimism. Resilient people don't dwell on negative information. Instead, they look for opportunities in bleak situations. How have you been optimistic in bleak situations? Resilient people have a moral compass. They have a solid sense of what they consider right and wrong, and it tends to guide their decisions. Resilient people have a religious and spiritual belief in something greater than themselves. The community support that comes from being part of a religion, part of this temple community, has never felt more valuable or more essential than this past year, has it? Resilient people are emotionally flexible and socially connected. They reappraise a difficult situation. They look for meaningful opportunities within, and they help others to navigate it. And resilient people have a mission, a meaning, a purpose, which gives them courage and strength. Resilient people are dedicated to a cause that they find meaningful, and that gives them a sense of purpose. What is your purpose? What are you dedicated to? How true has that been for so many this past year? Volunteering, attending rallies, educating and advocating for the Jewish people, for Jewish values. And maybe my favorite tool in the toolbox, resilient people also have a sense of humor. A sense of humor about their trials and travails. The old joke about Jewish history being summed up in the statement, "They tried to kill us, we survived, so..." It's a classic example of Jewish resilience through humor. Think of what's layered in that. They tried to kill us, we survived, let's eat. That's the definition of resilience. Jews are still here because we adapt, because we are resilient, and because of one other indispensable characteristic: hope. Rabbi Hugo Grin famously told a story, and I've shared it with you before, of his father in the winter of 1944 while they were together in a concentration camp. Having announced that it was the eve of Hanukkah, he took a homemade clay bowl and lit a wick from the strands of his uniform and immersed it in this precious, now melted ration of margarine. But before he could recite the blessing, Hugo looked at his father and protested, "We need the food, Dad. We can't afford to waste it on a candle." And his father looked at Hugo, and then at the lamp, and then back at his son, and he responded, "You and I have seen that it is possible to live up to 3 weeks without food. We once lived almost 3 days without water, but you cannot live at all without hope." Rabbi Lord Jonathan Sacks of blessed memory points out, people often confuse optimism and hope. They sound similar, but in fact they are very different. Optimism is the belief that things will get better. Hope is the belief that together we can make things better. Hope is the belief that together we can make things better. Optimism is a passive virtue, hope an active one. It takes no courage, only a certain naivete to be optimistic. It takes a great deal of courage to sustain hope. No Jew knowing what we do of the past, of hatred, of bloodshed, of persecution in God's name, suppression of human rights in the name of freedom of this past year, no Jew can be optimistic. But Jews have never given up hope. Hope and tragedy do not differ about facts, but about interpretation and expectation. And that makes a moral difference. Those who hope strive. Those who are disillusioned accept. In that respect, they are self-fulfilling prophecies. A morality of hope lives in the belief that we can change the world for the better. In this not unprecedented of times, the task of sustaining hope may seem daunting. Yet it is our sacred duty, and it is embedded deep within the soul of the Jewish people, even now in the face of rising anti-Semitism and violence and the trauma that we carry from this past year, trauma I never knew I carried. Even in face of all of that, we must refuse to give in to despair. Od lo avda tikvatenu. Our hope is not lost. As the Israeli national anthem, whose name is Hatikva, whose name is hope, reminds us. We must remind ourselves and one another that while history shows us many dark days, it also shows the strength, the resilience, and the adaptability of the Jewish people. Our survival is not only a testament to our strength, it is a call to action. It asks us, how will you adapt and practice resilience? How will you preserve our tradition and fight for justice and build community and bring light in a darkening world? And this is where hope comes in. Because hope, as Rabbi Sacks taught, is not passive. It is a choice. Hope is a choice. It is an action that we take. When you light Hanukkah candles, when we stand up for Israel, when we teach our children Torah and bring them to services, when we walk into this sanctuary on this holiest of holy days, we are choosing hope. We are choosing to believe that our future, like our past, will be filled not just with suffering, but with resilience, with creativity, with transformation. Hope is why we are still here. It is why we continue to adapt and practice resilience. It is why, even in the wilderness of a post-October 7th world, we continue to believe that we can make a better world. And so as we begin this new year, embrace hope. Hug it. Let it be the flame that lights our way. Let it give us the courage to adapt, to change, to build. Let it be the source of your resilience. Because as long as we have hope, there will always be Jews. And as long as there are Jews, the world will always have hope. Shana Tova Umituka. May this year be filled with hope, with strength, and with sweetness for all of us. Shana Tova.